welcome to the IFG this evening. We've been doing a series over the last year on policy successes in government. We wanted to do policy successes and failures, but you can't get anybody to turn up for failures. They would like to come to the successes. And this is the 7th in our series. The early ones were on privatisation, devolution, the Climate Change Act, the Pensions Commission, smoking bans, and the minimum wage. But this is last, but by no means least. Sure Start as Naomi Eisenstadt, who was the creator of Sure Start, if she doesn't mind my putting it like that. Sure Start was in all 3 party manifestos at the last election. It's there with other great projects like high-speed rail and House of Lords reform, which may or may not see the light of day sometime in the next 4 centuries. But this one is a big policy, 3.5 Sure Start centres nationwide, a transformation in state provision for 3- and 4-year-olds that has taken place. So it's not hope for the future, it's real achievement in the past decade. And we're delighted that Naomi Eisenstadt, who's also written a book, she's signing copies afterwards, special discount price, called Providing a Sure Start, How Government Discovered Early Childhood. Naomi is going to begin with a presentation on the Sure Start experience, and then we have a star-studded panel to comment. Tessa Jowell, who's Minister for Public Health, amongst many other things that she did during the Labour government for 2.5 years.
2.5 years, and was perhaps the co-creator of Sure Start.
We have the great thing about this is, by the way,
everybody wants to be part. Oh no, I really was.
No. That's 1997 to 1999. Kerry Oppenheim was in the number 10 policy unit. She's the vice co-creator.
Co-creation.
And Jan Casson, who works at a children's centre in Northumberland, is going to give us the experience on the ground. Naomi, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Actually, just to set the record straight, I don't claim to be the creator of Sure Start at all. I mean, what I did was respond to an amazing set of ministers, and I'm going to say a bit about that at the very end. And I was just very, very lucky to be at the right place at the right time. Where do we start with all this? What I'm going to start is take you back, and some of you in the room are old enough to remember 1997 and a new Labour government after 13 years. And I think the story of Sure Start, and the way I try to tell it in the book, is it's not just about children and families. It's a case study in a new government wanting to make policy in new ways. So it's a real story about how policy develops and policy changes, and how that works in terms of ministers' changes. I mean, the big treat for me in writing the book is that I interviewed all the ministers I worked for, and really had discussions with them on what they thought was important, what they thought they would have done differently, what they were really proud of. And it was just such a joy, and to have that kind of access, and to see old friends like Tessa and David. So how it all started was key features of a new Labour government. And of course, the thing that everyone talks about still about that Labour government was the relationship between number 10 and number 11. And I'm going to argue that as fractious as that was, and as negative as it was for a lot of other bits of policy, for children's policy, it was absolutely fantastic. Because you can't, if you're an official, it cannot get better than having the Prime Minister and the Chancellor fighting for the credit for your policy, and each upping the ante in terms of wanting to be seen to do the most for young children. But the key feature in terms of both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor at the time, which was very new, was, of course, the policy-making role of the Treasury. And what was very strange about Sure Start, and really unusual about Sure Start, is that the key ideas and key developments were a program that Tessa chaired, but was served by, of course, Norman Glass, the late and very well remembered and with fond memory, Norman Glass. So the things that happened was number 10 and the Cabinet Office did this thing called modernizing government. And if you modernize in government, and this is really important because a lot of it is coming back now in terms of the ideas about the big society. Services were meant to be user, not provider-led, co-created with the people they were for, community-based, designed by local communities. Services were meant to be evidence-based. Services were meant to be built on outcomes, not inputs. I hope all of this sounds familiar to you now. But these were the sort of key features about Sure Start, which actually were very, very important. And the reason modernizing government worked so well for Sure Start is, as Norman used to say, services for young children was then a policy-free zone. So nobody cared about under 4s. Nobody cared about under 5s, actually. There was very few civil servants working on any kind of early years policy in government. So it was very fertile territory to test out all these new ideas about how to make policy, not just new policy, but how to make policy. And making policy in a real co-creation way with outside experts, people from the field, and of course, working right across government. Now, the other real innovation in 1997, and again, people forget it was an innovation at the time, was the whole business about cross-cutting and coming from number 11, the comprehensive spending review process. So instead of budgeting year on year, you budget for 3 years, and you give some stability to the funding of programs in government, but in exchange for that 3-year stability, you have a set of outcomes that the department signs up to. These were called public service agreements. Remember public service agreement targets? In 1998, I think there were like 900 of them. They did go a bit wild on public service agreement targets. But the principle was very alien in terms of departments having to negotiate with the Treasury, not just how much money, but what the money was for. And that was a very radical idea. And of course, that was all about the Treasury taking a much more direct role in domestic policy formulation. So a new way of making policy through the modernizing agenda, and a new way of allocating resources through the comprehensive spending review process and the PSA process. And the third bit of the picture that was new was about new labor and children. And Tessa, you may think I'm unduly cynical. I think New Labour's interest in children was because they were easily the deserving poor, not the undeserving poor. And the deserving poor means that you can separate yourself from old Labour. And children are certainly the deserving poor. So all those three came together in what I describe as a sort of perfect storm. So they decided to do, I mean, it was Norman's idea, I think, to do a cross-cutting review of services for young children. There was a cross-cutting review on drugs. There was a cross-cutting review on juvenile crime. Cross-cutting review, i.e. looking across departments and using outsiders to say, you know, what are government's aims? What do we know about services for young children? And surprise, surprise, they found that poverty was bad for children. They found that it was particularly bad in the earliest years, so that experiencing poverty, living in poverty when you're very, very young has a longer-term impact on you than living in poverty when a child is older. Most of the public expenditure on young children, under 8, went on school-age children between 5 and 8. Several departments were involved in spending money on young children. They never spoke to each other. They had no overall aims and objectives. There was no clear picture in terms of what government was wanting to achieve for young children. And most importantly, well, two things. There was a wide difference in what was happening locally. And again, just think about the new localism agenda now. What there was in 1997 was it was up to local authorities to decide whether an area had nursery education. It was up to a local area to decide whether an area had child care. And therefore, services were very patchy and of mixed quality. So that whole issue about what was available, and they found that the right kind of services could help narrow the gap between poor children and the rest. Narrowing the gap was a big aim in 1997, as it is still, which means that we didn't do terribly well on narrowing the gap. Right, Sure Start is born. They did this comprehensive review. They founded all this, and Tessa chaired the review. There was one of the radical natures of Tessa chairing the review, and this, I always smile at these because I wasn't a civil servant at the time. I was running a national charity, so I didn't realize till I became a civil servant how radical some of these things were. So Tessa was a minister in the Department of Health. Norman, of course, was in the Treasury, but was working to a Department of Health minister. And this was all very exciting because you didn't work, people in one department didn't work to ministers in other departments. This was all, you know, really exciting. So an initial plan of 250 local programs, an allocation of £450 million over 3 years. The charity I was running was $6 million a year turnover, so it was quite a shocker for me. And within how Sure Start was designed, all those principles of modernizing government, user not provider led through the engagement of local parents, flexible and responsible to local needs, joined up across different agencies and professions, a focus on outcomes. Sure Start had its own public service agreement with its own targets. So it was a really, really comprehensive program. And evidence-based, and this is where the big arguments come. It was clearly evidence-based in terms of the need. It was clearly evidence-based in terms of, services for young children do make a difference. The design of the program, I came to the view while I was writing the book, the design of the program was not evidence-based. The things that the review team looked at that really worked for young children were high scope in the United States, the Abecedarian program in the United States. The things that they looked at were highly targeted on very poor children, were manualized, there was no local determination, the parental involvement was very much about what they thought parents should have, it wasn't a community development approach. So the approach they took was very, very different from the things that they saw that worked. Now, I have to say, again, I came to do that was the right thing to do, but the design of the program was not evidence-based. And that view I came to when I was writing the book. Sally Burlington, who isn't here, who was at the Treasury at the time, is rather defensive. She thinks it was, but I think it wasn't when you look at it. So in terms of the importance of early years, yes. In terms of the design of the program, I would say no. Then what about the evaluation? What do you do with the evaluation once the design isn't evidence-based? Well, the big debate was about randomized controlled trials, and I'll come to that in a minute. The other big innovation in Sure Start was the governance. So again, I got the job to run it. It was openly advertised. I applied for the job. I got the job, which was in itself an amazing experience. I felt like Lyndon Johnson rang me up and said, do you want to set up Head Start? It really was a remarkable experience. I did. I really did feel like that. It's amazing. I still feel that way, actually. What an experience. But at the center, I was based in the Department for Education and Employment. I was reporting to Tessa Jowell, who was a health minister, and Tessa was reporting to David Blunkett, who was the Secretary of State for Education. And what was very exciting to the civil servants at the time was that if there was questions on Sure Start in Parliament, Tessa would answer them in education question time. I came from the voluntary sector. I didn't know about any of these protocols. And my question to myself was, who cares and what does this do for children? But I have to say, civil servants were tremendously excited about the innovation of who answers which question in question time. But I have to say also, I came to the view that part of the reason these innovations were important is because once you challenge the way we do things, it frees people to think differently. So I don't feel as cynical about it now as I did then. At the time, I was thinking, oh, for heaven's sakes, who cares? Let's just get on and work with the kids. At local level, again, very innovative, a lead body, and a lead body separate from the accountable body to make sure that whatever organizations held the money didn't get to make all the decisions. And the other innovation at local level was the involvement of local parents. And apologies, those of you who have heard the story a million times, but it's really important in terms of the involvement of local parents. The test for did we involve, when they wrote the plan, did they involve local parents, was dog shit. So if the plan came in and they said we spoke to local parents and what they wanted was more health visitors and speech therapists, we knew they spoke to health visitors and speech therapists. Because that's what they do. If only there were more of me, everything would be fine. But if the plan came in and they said we spoke to local parents and they were worried about the dog dirt in the park, they were worried about graffiti, they were worried about... Local parents in these very poor areas were worried about the physical environment. They were not worried about more services. And that was a very important lesson for us. And it was a very important lesson for civil servants going out onto these poor estates who just hadn't visited these kinds of places before. I had worked there. I knew about these places. But it was a very important lesson for us that what we wanted people to want wasn't what they wanted. And government spends all its time wanting people to want what they think they need. And all governments will do that. So that was a real struggle. What were the big debates? I already talked about the big debate about program design, a big debate about evaluation, no randomized control trial. A randomized control trial only works if you have standard inputs. Once you decide to have 250 different programs locally, there's no point in doing an RCT. But the other thing is that ministers wouldn't have it. There was no way ministers would agree to an RCT because there was no way they could possibly conceive of it failing. And because once you have all that community engagement in developing the program, you can't say, well, you can have it, but you can't. It was really against the principles of what we were trying to do an RCT. So we didn't do that. Next big debate was expanding too fast. Well, this is a really interesting one, because this is another one where in the course of writing the book I decided that I was wrong and the ministers were right. Norman and I argued very strongly against the big expansion. We don't know anything yet. There's only 6 programs running. We're not spending any money. How can you double the size of the program before we have any evidence that it's working? And Yvette said to me, Naomi, there's an election coming up. You're crazy. So we went ahead and redoubled it. And the reason I think ministers were right and civil servants were wrong is because it wouldn't exist today if we hadn't done it. It was really that horrible Israeli phrase, facts on the ground. Once it's out there, it's very hard to take it away. And if we'd done a slow, steady, wait 10 years, make it better, it would be gone today. It would be a memory. The pilot programs, how many of those pilot programs were ever really scaled up? We just scaled up. We just did it. We thought it was the right thing to do. Another big debate was cross-government arrangements. We were originally linked with health, then we were linked with DWP. I think that we lost something when we lost the link with health, but we gained something with DWP. And the thing that really grieved me with health was that they didn't complain when they lost it. So that means we weren't that loved when we were there, whereas DWP were absolutely thrilled to get us, which was very nice. It was very nice. Another big debate was the employability agenda. Still, I get questions about, did Shorestadt lose its soul because it got interested in women working? Well, tell me how else you're not going to be poor. So I was a great believer, and still am a great believer in the employability agenda. I think that the only way not to be poor is to have a job, and I think that, Jan may comment on this, I think a lot of the people working in the local programs were resistant to the employability agenda because they wanted to make sure somebody was there on Tuesday afternoon to come to their aromatherapy sessions. The great aromatherapy debate, Andrew. I don't know if you remember it, but certainly I do. That was the problem. There was a resistance on frontline staff about women getting into work because they enjoyed working with them. So that was a big debate. Handover to local authorities, big debate again. But again, once we had Every Child Matters, once you had directors of children's services, you couldn't have a key official at local authority level responsible for outcomes for all children in the area except for the 600 on these 3 streets. You had to build it in to a system we were building. And that is the other key point. We were not designing an intervention, we were building a system. And that system had to link up with all of children's issues, not just under 5s. It really had to link up. The weakening of the ring fence, well, weakening and then gone. I do grieve the departure of the ring fence. I think that's the biggest threat to early year services. And the final one was the boards that had parents on them became advisory rather than management boards. And I think, again, that was a huge mistake. And, of course, now government is consulting on how to engage parents in management of children's centers. So it's back to the future. All children, poor children, seriously dysfunctional families. We never really were clear what we were for. To begin with, we were for the poorest 20%. Then we were for the poorest 30%. Then we were for all children. And now this government is interested in being for the neediest children. And I really think you need the universal platform to reach the neediest children. So what did we get wrong? Well, we got a lot wrong. Cross-government arrangements create over-ambitious expectations. I mean, Norman and I used to say Shorestadt and global warming. Every minister thought this was going to meet every one of their dreams and do everything. And the over-expectations, I think, led to real disappointment. Tessa will agree with this, I'm sure. We lost the babies. We were originally a -9 months to 4 program. We moved to, as soon as DFE, really encompassed the program. I used to say, again, apologies to my colleagues in the audience, when I went to the DFE in 1999, they thought children were born at 5. By the time I left, they thought children were born at 2. At least they didn't call them pupils anymore, So, but we did lose the babies. And the problem is it's the Department of Health who know about the babies. So I think losing and getting the babies back, I think, is a big challenge now. I think that's really important. Spending money fast and building a new infrastructure with local participation takes a long time. We really didn't anticipate how long it would take. People like me should have known better and should have warned ministers. And we did try to warn ministers, but they were so anxious to make things happen and to get results. All the analogies were wrong. The program managers weren't, they didn't have to be teachers, they didn't have to be social workers, they didn't have, every profession that we looked at wasn't quite right for what we were asking people to do. And I think the biggest thing we got wrong was not to build in staff development, career development for program managers. We did not acknowledge how hard the job would be. And we didn't understand, the trouble is Norman went around the country and he met me, and he met Margie Wally, and he met Gillian Pugh, and he met 10 really amazing women. I include myself in that group, very modestly. But he thought there would be hundreds of us out there, and there just weren't. There was Jan. Jan was one of them because she stuck with it. But, there just were not enough really, really good people, and we didn't build in the development opportunities for them. And that was the cost of expanding so fast. So we didn't pay attention to that. And lastly, there really wasn't an acknowledgement of what it meant to be a senior civil servant when you come in from the outside. So there were things I just didn't know, that nobody knew I didn't know. I remember asking my deputy several times about the baseline. I didn't know what a baseline was, and I couldn't believe there was such a thing as a baseline where you have this money for the year, and then next year you ask for that amount of money plus a bit more. In the voluntary sector, you don't automatically get the same amount of money again. You don't ask, I just couldn't believe there was such a thing as a baseline. The other one that was really funny is that when we did a special diversion for rural, again, my deputy was really worried about it. She thought we got it, did it too fast. So I went to Michael Bishard, who of course was then the permanent secretary, and I said, Michael, I'm worried. And he said, well, Naomi, this is what you have to think about. Do you have the money? We certainly had the money. Ministerial clearance, we had ministerial clearance. And then he said to me, is it legal? Is it what Parliament voted the money for? I had nobody told me I had to think about that. Obviously, as soon as he said it, but it's something that just puzzled me. I knew what illegal was, but I didn't realize what legal was. So I think, in some sense, not being prepared for doing it was probably a good thing because it meant I asked lots of stupid questions. And it meant I kept, I never could have picked up the 20 years of not being civil servant. So the added value I had was the not being a civil servant, was understanding how it worked out there. But the cost of understanding how it worked out there was that I really didn't understand how it worked at Whitehall, and it took me a while. We achieved a huge amount, and I know I want to stop in a minute because I want to give everybody else a chance. But, the most important thing we achieved was what Andrew said. Sure Start was in all three manifestos. But really what we achieved in about 10 years is an infrastructure and early years services that, although fragile, is sticking. And, the one thing I get really, really cross about, and I just told you all the things we got wrong. The one thing I'm not defensive about is this thing about middle-class people like it. For heaven's sakes, when did we ever say a school was bad because middle-class people wanted to use it? Have we ever set up a public service that was initially for poor people that everyone else was jealous of? So I consider this a huge success, and I still consider that a huge success, that we set up a new way of delivering services for under fives that now is embedded enough so that it's a vote winner. It wasn't to begin with. It was political will to begin with, but now actually threatening it, it causes people to worry about votes. So what are the lessons for policymaking? Well, I'm not defensive about the whole evidence-based thing because I think it's about mess, gut instinct, values, and evidence. And I think the ministers were right to go with their gut instinct and their values. And I think we don't think about that enough. These are politicians. They're meant to believe in stuff. And they believed in stuff. And I think that's a really good thing. As ministers change, policies evolve. And again, for Sure Start, that meant as we were getting evidence of what was working and what wasn't working, we could change the program as we went along. So again, I feel that really strengthened things. Cross-government policies need to make explicit the tensions. DWP wanted more childcare. DFE was worried about quality because they had a fundamental belief in education and cognitive development. Now, that's a completely natural tension, but you can't pretend you can have everything. And the trouble with civil servants is that they draft over the cracks. So they find a form of words that everybody agrees to and never have the argument. The most excellent people at passive aggression I've ever experienced in my life, because nobody's rude. but everybody is out, you know. So I think that drafting over the cracks is really, really important. Cross-government working can lead to tensions in your home department. Certainly, I'm sure that some of my colleagues in DFE were resentful of the kind of relationships I had with Treasury colleagues. I went straight to the Treasury when I was worried about something. I didn't know you weren't supposed to do that. And then when I found out, I didn't tell them I didn't know you weren't supposed to do that. Same thing with contacts at number 10. I just used contacts because that's what you do. I didn't know there were rules about how much you're supposed to. And implementation takes longer than you think and rarely looks exactly as intended. Edward quoted me. The line I used to use is, the minister thinks the announcement is implementation, the civil servant thinks it's posting the guidance. Tick, that's done. Implementation takes a long time and it's never like you think. The best thing about Sure Start was that it grew out of political will. When I go to other countries and I talk about what we did in Britain, they say, how did you do that? I said, I didn't do it. It was political will. Ministers wanted it to happen. We were given the task of making it happen, and what a privilege it was. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely brilliant. I hate to say it, but it really is true. John Prescott really did say it. The problem with a successful school is that more people want to go to it. So you can just ponder that. Fortunately, we still have 3,500 Sure Starts. Tessa, the floor is yours.
Andrew, thank you very much. And Sure Start would, forget the Sure Start would not be what it is today as a kind of treasured, national, widely recognised programme had it not been for Naomi. So that was the greatest job of underselling achievement I think I've ever heard. I want to just I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about how Sure Start was conceived, quite literally, about the pressures that refigured Sure Start, and the importance of universality. And you may feel, because sometimes I do feel quite sad about how far Sure Start has moved from my original, David Blunkett's original conception of it. But Naomi is right, the infrastructure is there, so it is possible to recreate what I think is the real burning need for intervention to support vulnerable, unconfident, too young mothers and their babies in order to prevent the recreation of the circumstances that have shaped their lives in becoming mothers too young. And so my original view of Sure Start was shaped by three things. First of all, my long professional experience as a family therapist, working both at the Tavistock Clinic, at the Maudsley Hospital, and tramping the streets of Brixton as a childcare officer. And my reading, obviously very widely about sort of theories of attachment, but very particularly the work of Donald Winnicott and the pursuit of the good enough mother. And the minute you move from the pursuit of the perfect mother to the good enough mother, you heave a sigh of relief. But the conundrum that I think I was very exercised by was this, that I would see children 7, 8, 9 years old, 2 children, and if you just simply read their case notes, their early histories were equally, just terrible. Absolutely everything you could imagine could go wrong in a young child's life had gone wrong. Multiple foster parents, abuse and so forth. But so often you would see 2 children, one of whom would be on the verge of, already showing the kind of conduct disorder at 6 or 7, which is such a powerful predictor of subsequent delinquency and criminality, and a child who was just holding it together and functioning, was able to organise themselves, able to sit in class, able to relate to other children, and had a capacity for empathy. And the question is, how does this happen? And it seemed to me, and I think that this is borne out by a lot of the research, and now even more powerfully confirmed by the research on neurological pathways in very young children. You know, the child who was making it had one person who loved them or believed in them for long enough for them to internalize a sense of their own value. And that to me was, you know, an incredibly powerful, so if you like, sort of end of the rainbow to try and follow. So when I moved from all this, you know, world of clinical practice and all the rest of it into politics, I very much took this with me, linked to this absolutely burning belief from perhaps best captured by Richard Titmuss 50 years ago, that services only for the poor are poor services. So if you want good services for children, you make them universal services. And I remember when, age 24, I chaired the Social Services Committee in Camden with an extraordinarily innovative but crazy director of social services. He had this idea that you could create children's centres where mothers would come and learn skills. This gives you a sense of how dated this is. Would make chocolate roulade. They would also be taught to look after their babies by women with whom they could identify. And these children's centres were at the time absolutely radical and sort of revolutionary. And I think Virginia probably remembers sadly, he died sometime, but he was an extraordinary man. So that was in a way the baggage I bought when I became the Minister for Public Health, linked to my own experience of just adapting to be a mother when my daughter was born, and thinking, as I went down to the family welfare clinic, as it was every Wednesday, and we had our cups of tea and rich tea biscuits in those green NHS cups, sitting around with all these other mothers who, you know, from a variety of different backgrounds, but what we shared was this sort of intensity beyond words of this new relationship with our new babies. And presiding was this woman called Kira Hayden, who was our health visitor. And I watched how she sort of bestowed a sense of confidence. I remember one mother coming with her 5 children under 6, and she'd lost a tooth for every child. And Kira somehow separated the 4 children, engaged with the mother and the baby, and her new baby, spent time with her with that sort of focus, you know. Relational public services is also the other thing we've got to move on to, but focused with that absolute intensity on this mother who, I swear, got up, swept her children up, and left looking taller than the shrunken figure that had arrived. So that was, for me, the kind of passion I brought to this Sure Start opportunity, together with my very, very close friendship with David Blunkett. And in a way, it wasn't, rational policy making that meant that I, as the Minister for Public Health, would run Sure Start from the Department of Health and David would from Education. We wanted to do this together because the other organisation that we had been both in our different ways very involved in was an organisation called Home Start, which provided very practical help to new mothers. As I remember the director once said to me, you know, when a mother has a new baby and she's finding it difficult to get to the supermarket, we won't do the shopping for her, but we'll help her how to manoeuvre a double buggy and a shopping trolley. So all that, as I say, was what I brought to this. And actually, you know, I think certainly when, what happened was that Gordon asked me to chair the cross-cutting review for services for children under 3. And it was a highly functional period of government. And actually, I have to say, although Gordon did think that you could have 60 babies in a room and they would all be well cared for by high-quality staff, absolutely. Something in Gordon understood what Sure Start, before it was even named as such, might be. And Tony never quite got it until, I mean, not for years, really, did he get it, but Gordon did understand it. But I have to tell you that Sure Start became something that it was not intended from the outset. Sure Start was intended as a nurture program to build that intimacy between mothers and babies, particularly those mothers who, unlike me and unlike Virginia, who was, we've been friends all these years, had lots of other people coming to say, wasn't your baby doing well? And, oh, here's some more flowers and all the rest of it. But those mothers who had none of that, who had none of that validation, and that was the other thing that exercised me. How do you manage without this, with your friends coming, with nice meals cooked for you and all the rest of it? So that's what Sure Start was meant to be. It was meant to be a nurture program for those mothers, to give them a sense of belief in their own capability to be loving, nurturant and caring mothers to their babies, so that they would become their babies' first teachers, and that we would recruit, if you like, sort of volunteer mums from my Kira Hayden network in Kentish Town, who would help support these mums, as so many were doing informally. And I have to say, I sort of felt, when I turned round 3 or 4 years later, far from being a programme that kept mothers and babies together, Sure Start was now getting mothers out to work, away from their babies. And so I felt that that was a great and missed opportunity, and I profoundly believe that that's the stage that Sure Start has now got to revisit and create. As Naomi said, the infrastructure is there. And I think the big question that we've got to ask every day, I know what was reassuring was when Sure Start was not about the kind of intimacy of human capital, but when there were visible, shiny buildings. Don't underestimate the importance of shiny buildings if you live in an overcrowded flat. But shiny buildings, and Polly Toynbee writing every week about the brilliant Labour government programme, was also its own impulse, to be absolutely... so Polly deserves quite a lot of credit for this. But Sure Start became something else, and in doing so, as Naomi said, it lost sight of the babies. I believe that unless you focus on the babies, you actually won't change the life chances of lots of the families that I represent in Brixton who really struggle. They struggled, when I first, was a childcare officer in Brixton 30 years ago, and they're still struggling. And that won't change until politicians recognise the significance of those early months, and how, by building that relationship of confidence between mothers and babies at that time, you can change lives forever. But you do it in a way which is universal. And every time I read a Sunday Times or Observer journalist laughing at Sure Start because the middle classes used it, I wanted to go round and smack them. And, it was, and the third point I just wanted to make is something about which I think we have to have a lot of concern, and that is the quality of the staff who work with small children, the levels of training, the levels of confidence, and every day we have to ask ourselves whether the 6 Sure Start centres we most recently visited, in each and every one of them, we would be happy to see our own children or grandchildren. And just because something is called a Sure Start centre is not a sufficient guarantee that the quality of care, the combination of nurture and education and development that the children receive there is enough to close that, all the terrifying indicators of what are likely to become lifelong inequality that are evident when a child is 5.
Yes, many thanks indeed. Kerry.
I very much agree with both Naomi and Tessa. I took a radical step to move from the world of policy and think tankery and to become a teacher. And I keep being surprised that you're all so quiet. Down from 5 and hope that nobody throws themselves out the window. So it's quite strange suddenly being in a policy audience, reflecting and thinking back on this time. The book is a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's very thoughtful. It really takes you through the journey of the establishment of Sure Start with a great deal of honesty and humour, which is absolutely what you'd expect from Naomi. I wasn't there at the start, so I can't possibly claim credit for Sure Start in any kind of way at all. Jeff Mulgan was there, and when I came into Number 10, which was in 2000, I was responsible for childcare. Jeff was responsible for Sure Start, and I did poverty, and Jeff did social exclusion. So it was one of the slightly more kind of bizarre ways we organised ourselves in Number 10. And eventually that changed. Jeff moved on to run the strategy unit, and then I took over his areas. So perhaps it's not surprising. I think what's striking reading Naomi's book and also hearing people is that actually with each change of minister and each change also of advisors, people came with their own sort of interests and baggage to the table. And I was really struck that not having been involved in the beginning, I think probably had quite an impact on how I thought about it. I was really struck reading the book about the ambition of the programme, which people have talked about the complexity of the task of building this, and the process. And I just wanted to very briefly reflect on that. It is easy, and Naomi said that it's just really easy to forget that in 1997, the UK was virtually a desert when it came to early years and childcare provision. There was hardly anything. Hardly, as a percentage of GDP, it was hardly anything. And we looked with envy at the Scandinavian countries in terms of the level of service. And it was, and Naomi quotes this in her book, it was an attempt, I think, certainly for some of us, to create a new frontier for the welfare state. It was another pillar, another part of the welfare state. And I remember going actually with Margaret Hodge and Polly Toynbee to Stockholm to go and see the wonderful Swedish system. And we did look with envy. And one of the things that was talked about, and I was really struck when you were saying this about it deciding elections, is that in Sweden and probably in other parts of Scandinavia, it is a deciding factor. It is a key factor in terms of how people vote. And that certainly wasn't the case in the UK before. It may, of course, now be very important. I hope it's very important to families and children now. Children don't get to vote, of course, until 18, but we're trying 16. And the other thing I was really struck by, which I think is the feeling that you have as an advisor as well, of course, as ministers, is that you only have so much time. You have a moment to try and do something. And it's incredibly important to be able to embed and do things with speed. And Tony Blair felt that incredibly strongly about many things. And so, of course, did Gordon Brown and the ministers in the departments. And it's really important, I think, not to lose that sense that actually the drive to deliver something that actually will stay and endure and be a legacy is very, very important. Naomi tracks in the book the move from Sure Start local programmes to this very large universal service. And I think is very honest about, yes, we did lose something about it, and we did lose the babies, but also we gained the creation of this service. And when I came into the policy, it was very much around the creation of what was then called the 10-year childcare strategy, which again was a cross-departmental approach. And it was trying to mesh together things that Sure Start did with other policies that were about families with children. And that felt very, very important to me as a mum and knowing lots of other parents and other people that work with children is that you don't actually see things in little boxes. You think about, actually, am I going to get leave from work in order to be able to pick the kids up at 4? What is the service quality good? Actually, am I going to get, if you're poor, am I going to get a top-up through a tax credit? You think about these things in the round. And I think that the 10-year childcare strategy was a very important way of trying to put Sure Start in a larger context, to make sense of it in a larger context, so that it became the sort of bedrock of early years provision that was universal, alongside right to request flexible working, alongside more financial support for families with children. That felt to me very important. Then within that, as people have said, it's very important to have targeted interventions that really do the job for poorer families with children. The complexity, reading that, you just think this was such a difficult thing to do. You had changes of minister, you had government machinery. Of course, decisions about government machinery are often made at incredibly short notice with the Prime Minister and advice, and not necessarily always that clearly, and you get these kind of bizarre and sometimes ill-thought-out outcomes. So it seems to me that it's really important that the politics is in there as much as the delivery, often at odds with the delivery. I think, as people have said, that just the sheer length of time it takes to embed a new service, a new institution, a new way of delivering a service, a new workforce. I mean, that is a really big and long programme. So it's not surprising that there were really a lot of hiccups on the way, and some things have worked and some things haven't worked. How? I mean, people have talked about their own window on the process, but I think one of the things that's really important is that the civil service was very porous. There were people coming in with lots of different kinds of experiences, whether it was from the voluntary sector, whether it was political experience, whether it was delivering the services. And I think that was very striking in 1997, and a really important change. And I think both learnt from each other. I learnt massively from working with hugely experienced civil servants who thought about problems in different ways and very, very systematically. But I also think that fresh blood was also incredibly productive. It was also very important about who had just had a baby, of course, because Tony Blair, I remember him pushing Cherie up the stairs when she was about to, not long from giving birth. Gordon, of course, had his baby. Jeff Mulgan was expecting a baby. Well, his wife was expecting a baby. It concentrates the mind, naturally enough. And, of course, lots of people who were kind of juggling a lot of that. The ministers, many of them were women. They were absolutely passionate about these issues. And, of course, the peculiarities of the number 10 and number 11 relationship. And I was just going to add one little anecdote, which I've not talked about before, which was there was a review that was done in the run-up to the 10-year childcare strategy that Treasury led, and I'd suggested that Lisa Harker, who was then later on my job share partner at IPPL, that Lisa Harker, who'd worked a lot on childcare issues, perhaps might be a good person to come in, and she indeed did come into the Treasury. And we had a problem because although the Treasury and number 10 sometimes talked to each other, sometimes they decided, just especially when it got quite close to the number 10 had to be cut out at that moment. And this was in the run-up to the party conferences, and Tony Blair was going to make his conference speech. Gordon Brown was going to make his conference speech. Nobody would tell, and they wanted to talk about childcare in the early years, what could be better. Nobody would tell me what was planned. And so Lisa popped over to my room at party conference with the latest papers will probably be done now on the Official Secrets Act or whatever, with the latest whatever it was, what was going on in the Treasury. And I said, well, Tony Blair wants to talk about extended schools, blah, blah, blah. And it was fine because we thought, actually, it's fine, it's perfectly compatible. They've each got something to talk about. And they both delivered their speeches, and they both talked about early years and childcare. So that was some of the more bizarre moments, but of course, actually, it was a good thing because you had the two most important people in government wanting to talk about this area.
It's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Achievements are just very, very briefly. I mean, I think it's really important that we look very closely at where it's been successful and where it's not been successful. And obviously, the evaluation is very important as part of that. But in terms of, especially in cash-strapped times, in terms of thinking about the initiatives that need to be built on, it's very important to look at that. So I think that very honest discussion about where it was more successful or less successful is something we should return to. it certainly was successful in building a system and service. It has done a hell of a lot for poorer children, but some bits work better than others. I also think the things that are quite hard is that we, in a way, it perhaps sounds a bit old-fashioned. I mean, we talked about delivering a service. The things where I think we were less good, but I think are better now, is the whole home learning environment. That actually, of course, it's really quite hard for governments to get involved in things at home. But knowing, and now I know very directly from the experience in the classroom, that people spend much more time at home than they do in any institution, and what goes on at home is really crucial. So really thinking about better mechanisms for doing that. The other things that I think never worked very well was the link to the tax credit side. Didn't work very well, and so the way in which the way in which the service was funded for early years and the way in which people paid for it, I think, needs a lot of rethinking. But yes, absolutely a hugely important legacy, and I'm really proud to have been a little part of it.
Kerry, thanks very much. And now from the view from below.
It's really funny, I was thinking last night about when Sure Start first came onto my horizon, and I read about it in the nursery world, and I wrote to David Blunkett and said, before you start the policy, come out and see what we're doing now. And we're doing it on a shoestring. And I was talking to somebody in the audience about, before Sure Start came along, one day we didn't have enough money to go out and buy some paper clips. I was on the floor of my office picking up paper clips. I just thought, this is actually quite sad. But we were doing things, as Carrie said, on a wing and a prayer. We were very poorly funded. And one of the things about now is that we've been poor longer than we've been rich. So actually we're quite a resilient service. I was a Sure Start advisor to 2 London boroughs, and I was working in Hastings at the time. And then we got Trailblazer status, and I cannot tell you the excitement on the estates on the day we walked around telling people we'd got all this money to set up this thing called Sure Start. It was overwhelming. It was actually quite frightening because we'd been very poor, and all of a sudden we had real money to make a real difference, and we were terrified we were going to get it wrong. So we spent a lot of time, more time than perhaps we should have done, asking people what it should look like. And I learned a lesson very early on. We were approached by dozens of architects who suddenly realised there was money to build these beautiful buildings. And we were, I heard about REBA. I mean, what was REBA? All of a sudden, we were getting, phone calls from people who'd like to come and build us a building. And I was walking through, it was funny actually when Naomi said, I was walking through one of the streets which actually had a lot of dog mess in it. And a mum had stopped me and said, what was I going to do about the playground? Because there's lots of dog mess, lots of broken glass. And this granny came over to me and she said, you're that woman who's got all that money to build for the kids. I said, yes, I am. And I said, would you like to come and see the plans? And she said, you've got a block of flats on that estate. Why don't you turn that into the Sure Start Centre? And it was like a kind of light bulb moment. And I thought, yes, here we are. We're going out to build this beautiful new building. But actually, we've not really listened to what the community was saying. And they were saying, there are empty flats, there are an eyesore on our estate. Come and turn that into your Sure Start Centre. And that's what we did. So I learned a very, very salutary lesson early on that you listen. You listen to everybody. You listen to the policeman on the beat. You listen to the lollipop lady as a source of information. I cannot tell you about, battles to fight in terms of, road safety and all the rest of it. But it was very, very important from day one to listen. And Sure Start, to me, helped me listen to our local communities. After spending quite a while as a trailblazer, I then decided to move from Hastings to Berwick, and I currently manage centres in Northumberland. So I go from the Scottish borders, and I cover 850 square miles. So one of the early things was pram pushing. We don't do pram pushing in Northumberland. The centre was meant to be within pram pushing distance. So I now manage 6 centres and 3 outreach centres across North Northumberland. And a lot of what Tessa was saying about the babies have been pivotal to the way we've managed the programme, I think, and I hope we haven't lost sight of the importance of babies. I was telling a colleague, we have a wonderful midwife who's based within our Sure Start Centre, and she starts her day texting all the teenagers who are in her care to make sure they've had a good night's sleep if they're still expecting. If the baby's popped up, where are they? Can she come and see them? If they're deciding to breastfeed, you know, if they hang on, she'll come round and have a chat. So, you know, I hope we're haven't lost sight of the babies. But in an area like Northumberland, although we have some very wealthy people who live locally, i.e., you know, the Duke of Northumberland, we also have a lot of poverty, and rural poverty was something I'd never seen until I went to Northumberland. It's very different from urban and city poverty. And Sure Start has allowed us to think out of the box and to work differently. I said before that the money was overwhelming and frightening. When the ring fencing came off, that was also overwhelming and frightening, because the feeling was that we would lose some element of control. And when we moved from governance, we had our partnership board, to advisory boards. Again, there was a feeling, you know, might we lose some control here? But I've been incredibly lucky in that my local authority has been amazingly supportive, as have the elected members, and we've managed to keep some of that autonomy. You know, we now have local authority control. The money does go into the early intervention grant, and we get what we're given, but we're part of that solution. We're still having that discussion. Very early on, the expectations of the local community were enormous, and people especially local elected members, felt we were going to set the world right overnight. I laughed when Naomi said about global warming. You know, people would say, "What's your job?" And I used to say, "Well, I'm responsible for reducing child poverty locally." You know, and it was actually very frightening, because people were expecting huge amounts from us. We had our public service targets. We also had lots of local targets, because in addition to all the targets set by the government, the local community gave us almost toilet roll lists of what we had to do, what we had to change. And actually that hasn't gone away. People still come and knock on the door and expect that if I can't give them an answer, the chances are I'll know somebody who can. And, you know, quite often that's what we do. We say no wrong door to the families. So if a member, you know, if a family turns up at the Sure Start Centre and wants help with working families tax credit, wants to know something about local housing issues, wants debt advice, or what we like to now call income maximisation advice, we do that. But also agencies will ring up and say, "We'd like to come and run this project. What do you think?" And that's great, because quite often agencies will turn up with pockets of money. And we've learned within Sure Start, if you join little pockets of money, all of a sudden you have quite a big pocket of money, and you can make a real difference. And that's what we're trying to do. I take what's been said about the workforce development, and I've got staff now who are at graduate level. I've got staff moving towards master's level. Most of my staff who work with our very small children are all graduates. And some of our youngsters who come on workplace experience when they're in school are quite taken aback that actually, you know, the lass who's changing the 2-year-old's bottom has got an early years degree, and, you know, is quite happy to work in nursery, and why aren't you teaching? And we spend a lot of time explaining to parents that we're very proud of the service we do, and that we are highly qualified, but actually we're highly qualified to do what we do, which is working with very, very young children. Just to round up, I mean, as I said, I've been really very lucky in that my local authority has helped me to deliver, but has also listened to what I had to say. We spend more time now mapping what we do. So although we're still a universal service, we try and target our resources at those families who need us the most. And of late, what we're trying to do is make sure that service doesn't stop at 5. So recently, we've cobbled together some money, and we now do street play at night. So I'm using my graduates and my play workers, and we're taking our little play vans, which are primarily designed to deliver to the under 4s. We go out into the estates and the streets at night between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock and do play. That's what Sure Start does. Sure Start brings innovation, it brings ideas, and the local community on an almost daily basis give me the next idea. They're also very good at bringing you down to earth. When we talk about, I had to laugh about the kind of baby massage. When you get it from local parents about what makes a difference. We were looking at baby signing, and one a young mum came along and she said, I like that baby signing idea. She said, but I can't cook. Can you do something about, can you set up a cooking course? Well, hang on, yes, this is absolutely right. We're talking about baby signing and baby massage, and we've got a whole host of young teenagers out there who don't do cookery anymore. So it's about keeping it real. I'm very proud of what we've done in Sure Start. We haven't always got it right. I absolutely agree with that. But it's a wonderful idea that still grows on a daily basis. And I'm just really, really pleased to still be part of it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jan. Who'd like to make comments? We have a number of people who've been engaged at the sharp end and a number of observers in the audience. Please, if you say who you are, because this is all being recorded for us as well.
Can I stand up, because otherwise I'm not sure looking at. Kate Jenkins, I'm at the LSE. Can I first start by saying I think what we've heard this evening is the most superb example of how good policy gets implemented and really makes a difference to people's lives. I was very struck, if I might say so, with the contrast with last night's occasion, where I thought we had a lot of very professional senior civil servants talking about their professionalism, but not relating it to real life in the way that Tessa and Jan in particular have done. I think it's a very important way of reminding us that what happens over here really matters elsewhere. Could I just come on to say that the issue of early years is not a new one. I broke my fingernails on early years in the mid-1980s. When the CPRS did a report on services for the children of working mothers, people said, but there aren't any working mothers with children. Excluding myself, I thought there were probably rather a lot of others. But although the Cabinet Office produced a report, nobody was interested, for the simple reason that it involved bringing together nursery schools and day nurseries, who were two separate professions who would not accept that it was remotely possible for them to work in the same building. So what's enormously encouraging is this tremendous step forward in the approach of the professions, concentrating on what children and parents need. I think I took very much your point about policymakers wanting people to want what they think they want. The interesting question now, I think, is what's going to happen next? And the development of child services has obviously got an enormous amount of creative potential within it. But I think I'm still concerned about the baby being thrown out with the bathwater, not merely the baby, but the whole principle. And I'd really like to hear people's views on what's going to happen over the next 5 years or 10 years or so, given the situation in which a lot of the areas which are heavily dependent on Sure Start are beginning to feel a serious pinch.
Should we take a few?
I think I will take a few. Also, just to supplement that point, of course, there were the nursery vouchers, which were there before.
That's right.
So I remember there was a big debate we had as to whether we were going to abolish them, what we were going to do with them, and all that. So the world didn't completely start in after 1997, but almost all of it did. Please, yeah.
I'm Nick Burkett from DCLG. Do any of you have any advice for Louise Casey and her new family's work, where you have some of the similar cross-cutting issue and political will, but very different circumstances in lots of other ways?
Dan.
Dan Corrie. I had some involvement from different departments in the early days, but then I had a couple of years at the Department of Education. And one of the things that happened then, so 2005, 2006, was the first big evaluation. And I mean, it's quite interesting reflecting on this as a kind of, how does policy get made and how do you stick with it? Because a lot of people were gunning for Sure Start. And for various reasons, that evaluation, which is quite a big bit of work done by good people and so on, but it hadn't been brilliantly designed. And it came out with results which basically said the whole thing was a flop. And I think that was another interesting phase where, in a sense, and there were some people within government who kind of wanted to leap on that as well and say, so, it wasn't a waste of money and we should be targeting much more and all the rest of it. And on the whole, I think, now my memory might be playing tricks here, but my memory is we all sort of held our nerve. We did try and change some of the details, and actually the next wave of evaluation showed it was much better. But I think that was an interesting period in the policy, and that you sometimes do, you know, that first big evaluation, you sit there waiting for it. Has this been making any difference or not? And that one said it hasn't been hitting the people that we want it to hit. And I think it's very important that people held their nerve at that moment.
Thanks, Dan. Please.
Thanks. Sean Musk, now with the Valuation Agency, but quite some years with the Civil Service College and its successor organisations. Around the time that Modernising Government came out, picks up very much on Dan's point about evaluation, because Sure Start just stands out as the example where the principles of modernising government were carried into a policy. And I think, I can't think of another example where it was so clearly done. And the evaluation point, I'd like the panel to comment on whether the fact that there was this commitment to evaluation that was made real actually gave a message to everyone out there, including us in the civil service, that we were interested in whether it worked or not, which perhaps meant that it was possible to hold the nerve, because I think it is all too rare in policy.
Thank you. Some more contributions?
The Department for Education and Department for Health, sorry, George Hosking, Wave Trust. Department for Education and Department for Health have recently produced a document supporting families in the foundation years, which I happen to think is an excellent document. But I also think the one weakness in it is, to pick up one of Naomi's points, it treats children as if they begin life at age 2. But under the philosophy of the current government, the initiatives for bringing in the policies that need to tackle the early years is really devolved to local authorities and also local health boards. I just wonder how in that philosophy we can get early years policies which really do take care of the babies implemented at local level.
Thanks. Any more comments, questions before I hand it to Anna? Naomi.
Right, I'll be quick so others can comment. And I'm going to go in the opposite order, actually, because I think it works better. I'll do the what next at the end. I think the document is really good, supporting families in the foundation years. And I think, Carrie, I don't know if you've read it, but it sticks very closely to the 10-year strategy. And the 10-year strategy then was refreshed, and now it's done again. And it actually does hold up to all those key principles. So I'm really proud of that. But you're completely right. It's absolutely postcode lottery. So what I say to early years colleagues is hold the government to account. They've published this document. They say this is how they think it should happen. Just say, this is brilliant. These are wonderful things that you want to do. Don't remind them that it's just like what Labour wants. Don't say any of that. Just say, brilliant, well done, government. Just let's make it happen. And you do that at central government level, and you do that at local level. You use it as a campaigning document. It is, I really strongly recommend it. It is very, very good, and it really does build on. It's better than the 10-year strategy, because it builds on it in terms of staff development. It builds on it in terms of quality. They're expanding health visitors like crazy. They're not doing terribly well on midwives, and I still think there's, but the one thing that we did do on babies, which Tessa, again, you need to take credit for, 9 months paid maternity leave. We are not expecting women with babies to go back to work. What I mean is about the journey, not the event. And if you're in the children's center with your baby, how about adult literacy? Because if you can't read to the baby. If you can't read, you can't get a job. So if you do that skills development around parenting, but those are the same skills that by the time the child is 2 or 3 or 4 might get you into employment, you really do hit both. So I think you're right. Devolution is a huge problem, and we will get a postcode lottery. And the infrastructure is fragile, so we really have to guard against that. On the did it work, both Sean and Dan, well, you see, I looked back on, first of all, Ted Mellish is in the audience, and I still believe the design of the evaluation was brilliant. Given how difficult it was, given that we, both officials and ministers, the way we designed the program made it impossible to evaluate. So given the impossibilities of evaluating it, I think the design was brilliant, and I think Ted and even Jay are to be congratulated. So I don't think those results were that bad. I mean, 86% of the sample, we were getting good results. The they were the poor, not the poorest. So in terms of who it was intended for, we were getting good results. The bad thing about the results, and I always say this out loud, is not that it wasn't working for the very poorest, it was doing damage. The very poorest were doing less well in Sure Start areas than in non-Sure Start areas. Now that was the dramatic finding that was so damaging. But that was 14% of the sample. 86% of the sample we were getting good results for, and that 86% were basically on the poverty line. So that it wasn't the middle classes were doing fine, it was the poor and the poorest. I think the design was right, and I think it is an excellent example of we learned as we went along, ministers did hold their nerve, and again, the next results got better. And I think a lot of the reason for those poor results was about just how long it was taken. I mean, Yvette Cooper's really funny on this because she had her baby and she was visited by the researchers. You know, it was a random selection of people living in the Sure Start area, and this poor researcher knocks on the door, and it's Yvette Cooper with her new baby. So, you know, so it was, and she said, you know, it was because nothing was happening yet because, you know, they hadn't built the building. So I still defend, I don't defend the evidence based on the design, but I do defend the evaluation, and I think it did help us get it right in the end. On what advice to give Louise, I mean, my big advice is good luck. I mean, the real issue on these very, very, you know, dysfunctional families, I won't use the language I used the other night that turned up on Matthew Taylor's blog. It's the all children, poor children, X families, you know, these most disadvantaged families, is that it requires a very sophisticated joined-up approach. And the real key to it, you see, I mean, Louise really understands these groups, but the real key to it is unless whatever you do locally gets into the head of the queue for adult mental health, for drug and alcohol problems, unless, I mean, there are really simple things we can do. I'll rant for one more minute, I promise, Andrew. But, for example, highest risk kids, or if you have a parent in prison, we still don't have a standard system of doing a family assessment when someone goes to jail, and we don't know if they have kids. Now, you're not hard to reach if you're in jail. You know, we should be asking, do you have children? And we should be doing a family assessment because up to 50% of boys with a father in prison will wind up in prison. So there are particular risks, very small numbers nationally, where you could do an assessment and put in the kind of stuff that Louise is doing. But it's expensive. These families are very high cost. And you have to be willing to invest, and you have to be willing to put them at the front of the queue, because if you can't get them the service, they will walk away. It's just not going to work. And it's not a new issue, I agree completely. The '89 Act actually was very, very good. But on what next, I still think that families in the foundation stage is a good basis. I still think the infrastructure is going to stick. I think we will not be able to invest in the quality that we need to invest in. I think Tessa's completely right, and others about the quality issues. But I think if we can hold on to the infrastructure for the next 2 or 3 years, when we begin to get money next, then the money should be on improving quality. One of the political problems, and I completely understand this, is that politicians like to announce more of, not better of. And investing in staff is about better of, and you don't get political points for it. So it's a really, again, it is about sticking to your nerve. I mean, just think of the kind of requirements we have for head teachers, and there are no requirements for someone who runs a children's center. They might be making locally, and might because Jan's a really great manager and she requires it, but there's no standardization of requirements for people to run these very, very complex centers.
Can I just put one more question to you now before we move on? You said that getting the call from Tessa was second only to getting the call from LBJ from Beyond the Grave to come and do Head Start. But besides that, you didn't mention international experience at all, even though, of course, as Carey said, large parts of the rest of the world, including Scandinavia, which Social Democrats have been visiting in awe for a generation, have been well ahead of us. What did you learn from what went on abroad that particularly influenced the design of Sure Start?
Well, I have to say, and I say this as an American, obviously, that a lot of what I learned from what went on in the States was how not to do it. because I think I don't think Head Start works. I think it's a poor service. They're not well trained. And Head Start is so targeted. This was my joke from yesterday. Head Start is so targeted and Harlem is now so gentrified that they have to bus kids in from the Bronx for the Head Start in Harlem because there aren't enough poor kids left in Harlem. So that targeting, what we know from EPI, from Effective Provision of Preschool Education, is that the kids are better with the mix. And Tessa says that at the mums. The mothers are better with the social mix. And if you create environments where you get a social mix, you're going to get better results. In terms of Scandinavia, 18 months paid maternity leave. As soon as you start having paid leave, the women don't leave their babies. They leave their babies when there's leave, but it's not paid because they can't afford to stay with their babies. So that was one of the big lessons from Scandinavia. But the truth is that the Anglo-Saxon model is a low-tax model. The European model is a high-tax model, and that's the choice. And so in terms of the Anglophone countries, in terms of Australia, the United States, Canada, and us, I think Britain is way, way ahead on the Anglophone countries. But on the European model countries, we're getting there, but we're not there yet.
Many thanks. Tessa?
I've just looked at my watch. I'm going to go for a vote at 7:45. So
I think we're finishing at 7:30.
I'm so sorry.
No, not.
I was shooting off. First of all, what's the advice to give Louise? I think Louise is one of the most extraordinary people in public service, and I've worked very closely with her, particularly, going out at night and when she was doing the street homeless project, the personal risk she put herself at. But there is something seamlessness about Louise between the people that she's working with and her, and that's what people relate to, and that's what these families will relate to. And I think we should be optimistic about the possibility of change with these families. Participle have done some extraordinary work with families in Swindon by creating for these families relationships which help them to be what you have to begin by presuming they want to be: good mothers, good fathers, functional brothers and sisters with a degree of family order. But it is high intensity for a period of time, but it works. And so I also think that, and this sort of touches on a number of the contributions, sometimes what you just need to do with policies like this is almost keep your head down and allow all the debate and story, to play out, above your head. One of the points that Naomi, and this was another, absolutely eureka moment for me, that in relation to the evaluation, because you're absolutely right, the predators were out at that time. But Naomi made the point that actually it's in London that you have these sort of diverse communities. If you go out of London, if you go to Leeds or to Manchester or even to Bristol, you don't get the degree of diversity you get, for instance, in Stoke Newington, from which emanated one of these appalling pieces about how it was completely ridiculous that this particular journalist could go to Sure Start. Wasn't it meant to be for poor children? So London is undoubtedly different, and I see it in my own constituency. So advice for Louise, I think the rest of the system would do well to adopt Louise's optimism, and I think also build enough of consensus about the need for long-term. And the great thing about the political phenomenon of Sure Start being in every manifesto is that it gives it a degree of resilience and protection from the instability of the electoral cycle. But it is one of the things that I have to say I've come back to, and I think we should all feel very exercised by, which is you know, what are we going to do about the, you know, for the babies that are born in the next month, that will mean that in 2020, these are children who are not going to be excluded from school. And that requires a degree of long-term commitment, self-confidence, and belief that the investment is necessary, and that sometimes you invest more in the short term in order that families discover their own resources in the longer term. And I'm more and more persuaded of the need for a degree of consensus in areas of policy that require a degree of stability in order to achieve change over the longer term.
Thanks, Tessa. Jan?
So, I'm sorry, I've got one more point. Is that...
Not at all. No, not at all.
I'm sure this is a point about you. One of the things that we always forget, and this is my Kira Hayden, tribute. One of the things that we always forgot, or often forgot, when we were measuring the impact of public services was the importance of the relationships that people formed. And I think if this government is expanding the number of health visitors, that's absolutely terrific, because there will be a period of time in the life of those young families when I bet you the health visitor for that mother is certainly among the 4 most important people in her life. And I think that that's an aspect of public service that we never properly recognise. And the language about sort of, you know, relational public services, and Jeff has done, you know, a lot of work on this, is clunky. But, you know, what is in there is the humanity of these relationships that allow people to grow and realise their possibilities.
Thanks very much. Jan?
Excuse me, sorry.
One of the things when somebody said about what's next, one of the things we've been looking at, because the money is getting tighter and tighter, and we're very conscious about outcomes and not inputs and evidence-based practice, is how we build resilience in communities. And certainly in Northumberland, we're spending a lot of effort trying to work with groups of residents. I mean, there are some estates where there's 800 houses, and there's 2 or 3 people who probably know the history of half the families who live on those estates. And by building resilience in some local people, that will go on, that will pay dividends for years, you know, long after I'm retired, and, you know, we've got another 10 health visitors in the locality. The people living on the estate need to take some care and control of their own destiny in some respects. So we're trying to build resilience in the communities, and that actually sits really well with, you know, the big society and the localism agenda. You know, I don't like the rhetoric, but actually it makes sense on the ground, and it's about trying to embed the ethos of Sure Start and being innovative and being brave and being creative and empowering, and again, that's another word I don't feel very comfortable with, but local communities to actually take some of the control on themselves. And that's where I think we'll see long-term gain when, and it's happening now where residents associations are coming along and asking, can they be worked with so that they know what their local families need? You know, that's actually fantastic. You know, it's not me knocking on the door like the brush salesman selling my wares. It's actually somebody coming along and saying, how can we make our community better?
Thanks very much, Jan. Kerry?
Just very briefly, I think it was very important, the holding of the nerve when things, when you get results you don't expect or you don't want to hear as politicians. And I think probably also the signalling that it was going to be evaluated is really important in terms of saying we're doing something new, we're going to look at how it works. And my memory was that actually there was quite a lot of change that happened, looking really closely at how good the parenting programs were, which were the parenting programs that worked, that didn't work, and actually moving towards what was always a tension, I think, in the policy, which was how far it was driven by the community and what they wanted, and how far actually the evidence suggested that some things that are sort of, you needed a certain kind of dosage of a certain set of services and practices would make more of a difference than others. And I think then what I witnessed then within the civil service was that actually there was really serious thought, changing different guidance that went out, a different kind of training. I suppose what is very difficult is just the implementation process, and now in a sense being a frontline, I'm now in the relational public services, I didn't know I was, is just witnessing the translation of government initiatives and guidance into what often seems to be like formulaic practice. I'm sure that's not true predominantly of Sure Start services, but actually I then worked with Robert Hill, who was involved in childcare and education, both in number 10 and in education. We worked with local authorities on looking at the implementation of some bits of the childcare strategy. And you just realise that what sounded, of course, very simple, like free, we increased to 15 hours, wasn't it? The free provision. But actually, it was sort of pretty complex to deliver it, because on the ground it was predominantly schools who were used to delivering sessional care. And of course, I mean, I think it's absolutely right that policymakers and ministers and special advisors just are bold and go out there. But the translation of that into effective practice obviously is a really long journey and has to be rethought at various points. So yes, one needs to hold one's nerve, but also you need to adapt and change in the light of the evidence.
Thanks, Kerry. And a big thank you to all our panel for a really excellent evening. So it was a thanks.